The Connecticut 2010 cold case that would haunt Milford for 13 years began with an empty chair. 28-year-old Kelsey Monahon never showed up to work that June morning, leaving her coffee to grow cold and her coworkers to wonder. When police entered her condominium, they found a scene of violent struggle, blood on the walls, a life stolen by brutal stabbing, and DNA evidence that would sit silent in storage for over a decade. The killer vanished like smoke, leaving a family shattered and a community afraid. Detectives made promises they couldn't keep. Years passed, technology evolved. And in 2022, when scientists fed new genetic profiles into the national database, one name emerged from the digital shadows: Brian Smith. A man with secrets, a man who thought he was safe. But in a world where truth never dies, even 13 years later, justice can still come knocking. Who was Brian Smith, and why did he kill Kelsey Monahon? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The morning light filtered through the windows of Kelsey Monahon's workplace, casting long shadows across empty desks and quiet hallways. Her coworkers arrived one by one, settling into their routines, but something felt wrong. Kelsey's desk remained empty, her computer screen dark, her chair tucked neatly against the edge of her workspace. "Has anyone seen Kelsey?" asked Sarah, her supervisor, glancing at the clock. It was already past 9, and Kelsey was never late. She was the kind of person who arrived early, stayed late, and never missed deadlines. Her absence created a void in the office that everyone could feel. Phone calls went unanswered. Text messages received no response. By noon, concern had transformed into genuine worry. Kelsey's family was contacted. Her parents hadn't heard from her since the night before, when she'd called to confirm dinner plans for the weekend. Her sister tried reaching her multiple times, each call going straight to voicemail. The police were notified that evening. Officer Michael Torres took the missing person report, noting the unusual circumstances. Kelsey Monahon was described as responsible, reliable, and deeply connected to her family and friends. She wasn't the type to disappear without warning. She had no history of mental health issues, no recent relationship troubles, no financial problems that might drive her to flee. As darkness fell over Milford, Connecticut, a small coastal town where serious crime was rare, 2 patrol officers drove to Kelsey's condominium complex on Broad Street. The building was modern, well-maintained, and considered safe. Neighbors often left their doors unlocked, children played in the courtyards until late, and the most serious crime anyone could remember was the occasional bicycle theft. The officers approached Kelsey's door and knocked. Silence. They knocked again, harder this time, their voices echoing in the empty hallway. When no one answered, they contacted the building manager, who arrived within minutes with master keys. Something was very wrong, and everyone could sense it. The door swung open, revealing a scene that would haunt the investigators for years to come. Kelsey Monahon lay in her living room, her body positioned near the kitchen entrance, surrounded by evidence of a violent struggle. Blood spattered the walls, furniture was overturned, and broken glass from a picture frame glittered on the hardwood floor. Detective Lisa Chen was called to the scene within minutes. A veteran investigator with 15 years of experience, she had worked dozens of violent crimes. But the brutality of this attack shocked even her seasoned perspective. Kelsey had been stabbed multiple times, her wounds suggesting a frenzied, personal assault. The killer had used a knife from her own kitchen, leaving the weapon beside her body. The condominium told the story of a life cut short. Family photos lined the mantelpiece, showing Kelsey at various stages of her 28 years graduation pictures, vacation snapshots with friends, holiday gatherings with her close-knit family. Her purse sat untouched on the counter, credit cards and cash still inside, ruling out robbery as a motive. Detective Chen called the Connecticut State Police Major Crime Squad, knowing this case would require their full resources. As the scene was secured and photographed, neighbors gathered in the parking lot, whispering among themselves, unable to believe that such violence had invaded their quiet community. The Monahon family arrived shortly after midnight, their faces etched with disbelief and grief. Kelsey's parents, Patricia and Robert, held each other as they spoke with detectives, providing what information they could about their daughter's recent activities, her relationships, any potential threats she might have mentioned. But Kelsey had no known enemies, no ex-boyfriends with violent tendencies, no coworkers who had shown inappropriate interest. The investigation began immediately, even as the family's world collapsed around them. Crime scene technicians worked through the night, collecting every piece of potential evidence from Kelsey's condominium. They photographed bloodstain patterns, lifted fingerprints from surfaces throughout the apartment, and carefully bagged personal items that might hold clues to the killer's identity. The most promising evidence came from beneath Kelsey's fingernails. She had fought back, and in doing so had potentially scratched her attacker, The biological material collected would be processed for DNA analysis, a technology that had revolutionized criminal investigations in recent years. If the killer was already in the system, they would have answers quickly. Detective Chen interviewed neighbors throughout the building, hoping someone had seen or heard something unusual. Mrs. Rodriguez, who lived directly below Kelsey, remembered hearing what sounded like furniture being moved around 10:30 the previous evening, but she had assumed Kelsey was rearranging her living room. No one reported seeing unfamiliar faces in the building or noticing any suspicious vehicles in the parking area. The canvassing expanded to the broader neighborhood. Officers knocked on doors, spoke with business owners, and reviewed security camera footage from nearby establishments. A convenience store 2 blocks away had recorded several vehicles passing by during the estimated time of the murder, but the footage was too grainy to identify license plates or occupants. DNA samples were rush processed at the state laboratory. The genetic profile was clear and complete, indicating a male perpetrator who was not related to Kelsey. The profile was immediately entered into CODIS, the national DNA database, but no match was found. The killer was not a convicted felon, or if he was, his DNA had never been collected and stored. Detective Chen stared at the evidence board in the conference room, studying the photographs and timeline they had assembled. The killer had entered through the front door, suggesting Kelsey knew him or had willingly let him inside. The attack appeared to be impulsive rather than premeditated, given that he used her own kitchen knife. But without a suspect, even the clearest evidence was useless. The funeral was held on a gray Thursday morning at St. Mary's Catholic Church, where Kelsey had been baptized as an infant and confirmed as a teenager. The pews overflowed with mourners, family members, childhood friends, college roommates, and co-workers who had come to honor her memory and support her grieving parents. Father Martinez spoke about Kelsey's generous spirit and her commitment to helping others. She had volunteered at the local food bank, tutored children after school, and always made time for friends who needed support. Her life had been a testament to kindness and compassion, making her violent death even more difficult to understand. Patricia Monahon stood at the podium with tears streaming down her face, speaking about the daughter she had lost. Kelsey believed in justice, she said, her voice breaking. She believed that good would always triumph over evil. We have to believe that too, even now, even when it feels impossible. Whoever did this to our daughter, wherever you are, we will find you. The truth will come out. The funeral procession stretched for blocks as it made its way to Milford Cemetery. Kelsey was laid to rest under a large oak tree, her gravestone bearing the inscription, "Beloved daughter, sister, and friend, your light continues to shine." Pink roses, her favorite flower, covered the casket as family and friends said their final goodbyes. Detective Chen attended the service, both to pay her respects and to observe the crowd. Sometimes killers attended their victims' funerals, drawn by morbid curiosity or a desire to see the pain they had caused. She studied faces in the congregation, looking for anyone who seemed out of place or whose grief appeared forced or artificial. As the cemetery slowly emptied, the Monahon family lingered beside the grave, reluctant to leave their daughter in the cold ground. They had buried her body, but they refused to bury the case. They would not let her murder become just another unsolved file. In the weeks following Kelsey's funeral, Detective Chen and her team pursued every possible lead. They interviewed Kelsey's ex-boyfriends, all of whom had solid alibis and willingly provided DNA samples that ruled them out as suspects. They looked into registered sex offenders living within a 50-mile radius of Milford, finding several men with histories of violence against women, but none of their DNA profiles matched the evidence from the crime scene. Tips poured in from the public after news coverage of the murder. A woman claimed she had seen Kelsey arguing with a man in a baseball cap outside her building the day before the murder, but when shown photo lineups, she couldn't identify anyone. A teenage neighbor reported hearing screaming around the time of the attack, but when pressed for details admitted he might have been confusing it with a movie he was watching. The investigation expanded to examine Kelsey's financial records, social media accounts, and cell phone data. Nothing revealed any unusual activity or suspicious contacts in the days leading up to her death. Her last text message had been sent to her sister, confirming their weekend plan. Her last phone call was to her mother, a routine check-in that ended with, "I love you too, Mom." Detective Chen felt the case slipping away from her. Without a suspect or a clear motive, the investigation was losing momentum. The physical evidence was strong, but it needed someone to match it against. The DNA profile sat in the database like a key without a lock, waiting for the right comparison to appear. 3 months after the murder, the case was reassigned to the Cold Case Unit. Detective Chen cleaned out her files, boxing up photographs, witness statements, and laboratory reports. She wrote a detailed summary of the investigation, hoping that fresh eyes might see something she had missed. But in her heart, she feared that Kelsey Monahon's killer would never be found. The Monahon family appeared on local television 6 months after Kelsey's death, their faces etched with grief, but their determination unshaken. They sat together on the studio couch, Patricia clutching a framed photograph of her daughter, Robert's jaw set in grim resolve. "Someone knows something," Patricia said, looking directly into the camera. "Someone saw something that night, heard something, knows something about who killed our daughter. We're begging you to come forward." Kelsey was only 28 years old. She had her whole life ahead of her. She wanted to get married, have children, make a difference in the world. That was all taken away from her, and we need to know why. The family announced a $25,000 reward for information, leading to an arrest and conviction in Kelsey's case. The money came from their savings, their retirement fund, and donations from friends and community members who wanted to help. They had also created a memorial scholarship in Kelsey's name at her alma mater, ensuring that her commitment to education would continue even after her death. Robert Monahon spoke about the impact of the loss on their family. "We can't move on until we have answers," he said. "Every day we wake up thinking about Kelsey, wondering who did this to her and why. We think about all the birthdays she'll never celebrate, the holidays she'll never share with us, the grandchildren she'll never give us. This person didn't just kill our daughter, they destroyed our entire family." The television interview generated dozens of new tips, but none led to substantive leads. Anonymous callers suggested ex-boyfriends who had already been cleared, pointed fingers at neighbors who had solid alibis, and offered theories based on rumors and speculation rather than facts. As the cameras packed up and the reporters left, the Monahon family walked out of the studio hand in hand, their faces reflecting both hope and despair. They had done everything they could think of to keep Kelsey's case in the public eye. Now they could only wait and pray that someone, somewhere, would find the courage to tell the truth. By December 2010, 6 months after Kelsey's murder, the investigation had officially gone cold. Detective Chen's replacement, Detective James Morrison, reviewed the file periodically but had no new avenues to explore. The DNA evidence remained unmatched in the database, and no new witnesses had come forward despite the family's public appeals and reward offer. The case file was moved to a storage room in the basement of the Milford Police Department, joining dozens of other unsolved crimes that had grown cold over the years. The evidence was carefully preserved in climate-controlled conditions, the DNA samples, the murder weapon, the photographs, the witness statements, all waiting for a breakthrough that might never come. Detective Morrison made periodic attempts to revive the investigation. He re-interviewed key witnesses, reviewed the evidence, and submitted the DNA profile to the database quarterly in case new samples had been added. But the Connecticut State Police Major Crime Squad had moved on to active cases, and resources were limited for investigations that showed no promise of resolution. The Monahon family marked the 1-year anniversary of Kelsey's death with a memorial service at the cemetery. Pink roses covered her grave, and candles flickered in the evening breeze as family and friends shared memories of the daughter, sister, and friend they had lost. Patricia Monahon spoke about the pain of living without answers, the frustration of watching her daughter's case fade from public attention. "1 year ago, someone in this community committed murder," she said, her voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "That person is still walking free, still living their life while my daughter lies in the ground. I want them to know that we haven't forgotten. We will never forget. And someday, somehow, the truth will come out." As 2011 began, Kelsey's case joined the ranks of cold cases that families never forget but police departments struggle to solve. The file would remain in storage for over a decade, waiting for technology and time to reveal its secrets. The years passed slowly for the Monahon family. Each birthday that Kelsey would never celebrate, each holiday she would never share, each milestone she would never reach became a reminder of the violence that had stolen her life. Patricia kept Kelsey's bedroom exactly as she had left it, her clothes still hanging in the closet, her books still stacked on the nightstand, her favorite perfume still sitting on the dresser. Robert threw himself into his work, trying to distract himself from the grief that threatened to consume him. He aged rapidly in the years following his daughter's death, his hair turning gray, his face bearing lines that hadn't been there before. He struggled with depression and anger, sometimes lashing out at family members who suggested they needed to find a way to move forward. Kelsey's younger sister, Jennifer, graduated from college in 2012 but couldn't bring herself to celebrate. How could she achieve the milestones that had been stolen from Kelsey? She considered changing her major from education to criminal justice, thinking she might become a detective and help solve cases like her sister's. But the trauma of losing Kelsey made it difficult for her to focus on her studies. Every few months, Detective Morrison would call with updates that weren't really updates. He would tell them that the case remained active, that new DNA samples were still being compared against the evidence from Kelsey's murder, that he was still following up on occasional tips. But they all knew the truth. The case had gone cold, and without new evidence or a witness coming forward, it was unlikely to be solved. The family attended support groups for victims' families, where they met other people living with similar losses and unanswered questions. They learned coping strategies and found comfort in shared experiences, but nothing could fill the hole that Kelsey's death had created in their lives. As the years stretched on, some well-meaning friends and relatives began to suggest that maybe it was time to accept that they might never know who killed Kelsey. But the Monahons refused to give up hope, lighting a candle on her birthday each year and maintaining faith that justice would eventually prevail. By 2020, 10 years had passed since Kelsey Monahon's murder. The world had changed dramatically during that decade. Smartphones had become ubiquitous, social media had revolutionized communication, and forensic science had advanced in ways that seemed impossible in 2010. But for the Monahon family, time had stopped on that June night when their daughter was killed. Patricia and Robert were now in their 60s, their health declining under the weight of a decade of grief and stress. Patricia had developed chronic insomnia, lying awake at night thinking about her daughter and the person who had killed her. She had become an advocate for other victims' families, speaking at conferences and lobbying for increased funding for cold case investigation. Jennifer had eventually found her way forward, becoming a social worker who specialized in helping families cope with violent crime. She married and had children of her own, but she always felt Kelsey's absence at family gatherings. Her daughter bore Kelsey's middle name Grace, ensuring that some part of her aunt would live on in the next generation. The case file in the Milford Police Department basement had become a symbol of justice delayed but not forgotten. Detective Morrison had retired in 2018, passing the case to Detective Sarah Williams, a younger investigator who brought fresh eyes and modern techniques to the cold case unit. She had reviewed Kelsey's file multiple times, always struck by the quality of the evidence and the thoroughness of the original investigation. Detective Williams knew that advances in DNA technology had made it possible to extract genetic profiles from smaller and more degraded samples than had been possible in 2010. She also knew that genealogical databases had grown exponentially, offering new ways to identify suspects even when their DNA wasn't directly in the criminal database. As 2020 drew to a close, Detective Williams made a decision that would change everything. She picked up her phone and called the Connecticut Cold Case Unit, requesting that they take another look at the Kelsey Monahon case. It was time to apply 21st century science to a decade-old crime. The Connecticut Cold Case Unit was established in 2019 as part of a statewide initiative to address unsolved crimes using advanced forensic techniques and fresh investigative approaches. Led by Detective Captain Maria Rodriguez, the unit consisted of experienced investigators, forensic scientists, and analysts who specialized in breathing new life into dormant cases. When Detective Williams submitted Kelsey's case for review, it immediately caught the attention of the cold case team. The evidence was well preserved, the original investigation had been thorough, and the DNA profile was clear and complete. Most importantly, technological advances in the past decade offered new possibilities for identifying the unknown perpetrator. Dr. Jennifer Kim, the unit's lead forensic scientist, explained the evolution of DNA analysis since 2010. We can now extract usable profiles from samples that would have been considered too small or degraded 10 years ago, she told Detective Williams. We also have access to genealogical databases that contain millions of genetic profiles from people who have submitted DNA samples for ancestry research. The genealogical approach had revolutionized cold case investigations across the country. By comparing crime scene DNA to genetic profiles in ancestry databases, investigators could identify potential relatives of unknown perpetrators. Family trees could then be constructed, leading to suspects who had never been in the criminal justice system. Dr. Kim retrieved the evidence samples from Kelsey's case, including the biological material that had been collected from under the victim's fingernails. The original DNA extraction had yielded a complete male profile, but in 2010, the only option had been to compare it against convicted offenders in the criminal database. Now, they had many more options. The reanalysis would take several weeks, but for the first time in a decade, the Monahon family had reason to hope. Detective Rodriguez called Patricia Monahon personally to explain what the cold case unit would be doing, careful not to promise results, but emphasizing that new tools were available that hadn't existed when Kelsey was killed. Science has come so far, Dr. Kim explained to her team. DNA that sat silent for 10 years might finally be ready to tell its story. In the sterile environment of the State Forensic Laboratory, Dr. Kim and her team began the painstaking process of re-examining evidence from Kelsey Monahon's murder. They worked with samples that had been carefully preserved in freezers for over a decade, handling each vial with the reverence due to evidence that might finally bring justice to a grieving family. The original DNA extraction had been performed according to the best practices of 2010, but technological improvements meant that more genetic information could now be obtained from the same samples. New extraction techniques could recover DNA from smaller cell quantities, and enhanced amplification methods could produce readable profiles from degraded biological material. Dr. Kim's team used a process called STR-based DNA typing, which examined specific locations on chromosomes where DNA sequences varied between individuals. The enhanced analysis confirmed the original profile but provided additional genetic markers that increased the discriminatory power of the evidence. They now had a more complete genetic fingerprint of Kelsey's killer. The next step was to prepare the DNA profile for comparison against genealogical databases. Unlike the criminal database, CODIS, which contained profiles from convicted offenders, genealogical databases were filled with genetic information from ordinary people who had submitted DNA samples to learn about their ancestry or find biological relatives. Companies like Ancestry DNA, 23andMe, and GE Deadmatch had collected millions of genetic profiles over the past decade. While privacy concerns prevented direct law enforcement access to most commercial databases, GE Deadmatch allowed users to opt in to law enforcement searches, providing a valuable resource for cold case investigations. The process required converting the forensic DNA profile into a format compatible with genealogical analysis. Dr. Kim's team worked with specialized software to predict what the crime scene sample would look like if it had been processed using ancestry testing methods rather than forensic techniques. As the computers processed the genetic data, Dr. Kim felt a familiar mixture of excitement and anxiety. She had worked on dozens of cold cases, and she knew that each analysis could either provide a breakthrough or confirm that the evidence still wasn't enough to identify a suspect. The laboratory's computer systems worked through the night, comparing Kelsey's killer's DNA profile against thousands of genetic profiles in the genealogical database. The process was complex, searching for shared genetic markers that would indicate biological relationships between the unknown perpetrator and people who had voluntarily submitted their DNA for ancestry analysis. At 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in March 2022, the computer delivered its results. Dr. Kim stared at her monitor, hardly believing what she was seeing. The system had identified several potential matches, people who shared enough genetic material with the crime scene sample to suggest they were related to the perpetrator. The closest match was a woman named Carol Thompson, who appeared to share approximately 1,200 centimorgans of DNA with the unknown male. This level of genetic similarity suggested she was either a first cousin or an aunt to the perpetrator. Additional matches indicated other potential relatives at varying degrees of separation. Dr. Kim immediately called Detective Captain Rodriguez with the news. For the first time in 12 years, they had a genetic roadmap that could lead them to Kelsey Monahon's killer. The next phase of the investigation would involve genealogical analysis, constructing family trees to identify all potential male relatives of the genetic matches who would have been the right age and in the right geographic area in 2010. The genealogical work was turned over to genetic genealogist Dr. Michael Foster, who specialized in using DNA matches to identify unknown individuals. Dr. Foster accessed public records, obituaries, birth certificates, and marriage records to build comprehensive family trees around the genetic matches. Carol Thompson, the closest match, had uploaded her DNA profile to find information about her father, who had been adopted. Through painstaking research, Dr. Foster traced her lineage back several generations, identifying all the male descendants who could potentially be the source of the crime scene DNA. One name that emerged from the analysis was Brian David Smith, Carol Thompson's first cousin. Born in 1975, he would have been 35 years old at the time of Kelsey's murder. Dr. Foster's research into Brian Smith revealed a troubling pattern that made him an increasingly compelling suspect. Public records showed that Smith had lived in Waterbury, Connecticut, in 2010, only 20 miles from Milford, where Kelsey was murdered. He had a history of minor criminal offenses, including arrests for domestic violence, public intoxication, and disorderly conduct, though none had resulted in DNA collection that would have placed his profile in the criminal database. The genealogical analysis also revealed that Smith had connections to Milford beyond geographic proximity. Employment records showed that he had worked for a landscaping company that serviced several condominium complexes in the area, potentially giving him knowledge of residential buildings and their security measures. While investigators couldn't yet prove he had ever been to Kelsey's specific complex, the possibility existed. Detective Captain Rodriguez assembled a task force to investigate Brian Smith further. They obtained surveillance photographs from his current workplace and residence, documenting his daily routines and confirming his current address in Waterbury. Background checks revealed a pattern of short-term employment, frequent moves, and strained relationships with family members. Most significantly, the investigation revealed that Smith had been arrested twice for domestic violence against former girlfriends. Both women described him as controlling and prone to explosive anger, especially when drinking. One ex-girlfriend had obtained a restraining order against him in 2011, less than a year after Kelsey's murder, citing fears for her safety. The task force contacted Smith's former employers, co-workers, and acquaintances, trying to piece together his activities and whereabouts in June 2010. Several people remembered him as unreliable and temperamental, someone who often called in sick to work and had few close friendships. Nobody could provide a specific alibi for the night of Kelsey's murder, but after 12 years, few people had clear memories of where they had been on any particular evening. Detective Rodriguez knew they needed more than genealogical analysis to build a case against Smith. They needed to obtain his DNA directly and confirm the match through traditional forensic methods. The investigation into Brian Smith required careful planning and surveillance to gather sufficient evidence for an arrest warrant. Detective Rodriguez and her team knew they would have only one chance to get this right. If they approached Smith too early or without sufficient evidence, he might flee or destroy potential evidence that could strengthen the case. Over several weeks, investigators conducted discreet surveillance of Smith's activities, documenting his routines and identifying opportunities to obtain his DNA through legal means. They followed him to restaurants, hoping to collect utensils or cups he had used, but Smith was cautious about leaving behind potential evidence, almost as if he suspected he was being watched. The breakthrough came when Smith was arrested for public intoxication outside a bar in Waterbury. As part of the booking process, police were legally authorized to collect DNA samples for comparison against unsolved crimes. The timing seemed providential. Smith had provided the very evidence they needed to confirm or rule him out as Kelsey's killer. The DNA sample was rush processed at the state laboratory, with Dr. Kim personally overseeing the analysis. The comparison would be straightforward. Either Smith's genetic profile would match the crime scene evidence, or the genealogical analysis had led them down the wrong path. Meanwhile, Detective Rodriguez contacted the Monahon family to let them know that significant progress was being made in Kelsey's case. She was careful not to reveal specific details or raise false hopes, but she wanted them to know that their daughter had not been forgotten and that new evidence was being analyzed. Patricia Monahon received the call while at work, and she had to excuse herself to cry in private. After 12 years of silence, the possibility that they might finally have answers seemed almost too good to believe. She called Robert and Jennifer to share the news, and for the first time in over a decade, the family allowed themselves to hope that justice might finally be within reach. The DNA analysis would take 48 hours, 2 days that would determine whether Brian Smith was a dead end or Kelsey Monahon's killer. Dr. Kim worked late into the evening, running and rerunning the DNA comparison to ensure absolute certainty in her results. The genetic markers aligned perfectly. Brian Smith's DNA was a definitive match to the biological evidence collected from under Kelsey Monahon's fingernails 12 years earlier. The statistical probability of the match being coincidental was less than 1 in several trillion. At 9:15 p.m. on April 14, 2022, Dr. Kim called Detective Captain Rodriguez with the confirmation they had all been hoping for. After 12 years, 4 months, and 8 days, they had identified Kelsey's killer. Brian David Smith, a 35-year-old man with a history of violence against women, had murdered a 28-year-old woman he may have never met before that June night in 2010. The next morning, Detective Rodriguez convened a meeting with prosecutors from the state's attorney's office to review the evidence and plan the arrest. The DNA match was conclusive, but they needed to build a comprehensive case that would hold up in court and convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. Prosecutors reviewed Smith's background, looking for any connections to Kelsey or explanations for why he might have targeted her specifically. They found no evidence that the two had ever met, suggesting that Kelsey had been the victim of a random attack by someone who had somehow gained access to her building. The landscaping connection remained the most likely explanation for how Smith had knowledge of the condominium complex. Investigators theorized that he had either been to the building for work or had learned about its layout and security measures from co-workers who had serviced the property. The attack appeared to have been opportunistic rather than premeditated. Detective Rodriguez coordinated with local police in Waterbury to plan Smith's arrest. They would need to move quickly and decisively, as Smith had demonstrated a pattern of violence and might pose a danger to others if he realized he was being investigated. The arrest was scheduled for the following Tuesday morning, giving prosecutors time to prepare the necessary warrants and charges. On April 19, 2022, at 6:30 a.m., a team of Connecticut State Police officers and detectives surrounded Brian Smith's apartment building in Waterbury. Detective Captain Rodriguez led the operation, coordinating with local police to ensure all exit routes were covered and nearby residents were kept safe during the arrest. Smith answered his door in a bathrobe, squinting against the morning light and appearing surprised to see law enforcement officers on his doorstep. "Brian David Smith," Detective Rodriguez announced, "you are under arrest for the murder of Kelsey Monahon." The handcuffs clicked into place as Smith's face went pale, his eyes darting between the officers as if looking for an escape route that didn't exist. The arrest was swift and without incident. Smith made no statements to police, invoking his right to remain silent and requesting an attorney. He was transported to the Connecticut State Police Barracks for processing and booking on charges of murder in the first degree, home invasion, and assault in the first degree. News of the arrest spread quickly through law enforcement circles and then to the media. By noon, reporters had gathered outside the courthouse and the police station, eager to cover the breakthrough in a case that had haunted Milford for over a decade. The Monahon family was notified before the news became public, giving them a few hours to process the information privately. Patricia Monahon described the moment she learned of the arrest as a mixture of relief and renewed grief. "For 12 years, we wondered who killed our daughter," she said later. "Now we know his name and his face. It doesn't bring Kelsey back, but it means she didn't die forgotten. Someone will finally be held accountable for what they did to our family." Social media exploded with news of the arrest, as true crime enthusiasts and local residents shared the story across multiple platforms. The hashtag #Justice for Kelsey began trending in Connecticut, accompanied by photos of the young woman whose murder had finally been solved through advances in DNA technology and the persistence of investigators who refused to give up. The press conference was held at 3 p.m. in the main conference room of the Connecticut State Police headquarters. Detective Captain Rodriguez stood at the podium, flanked by representatives from the state's attorney's office and the Milford Police Department, facing a room packed with reporters, television cameras, and members of the public who had followed Kelsey's case for years. "Today, I can announce that we have made an arrest in the 2010 murder of Kelsey Monahon," Rodriguez began, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the moment. "Brian David Smith, age 47, has been charged with murder in the first degree in connection with Miss Monahon's death. This arrest was made possible through advances in DNA technology and the tireless work of investigators who never gave up on finding justice for Kelsey and her family." State's Attorney William Chen outlined the charges against Smith and explained how genetic genealogy had led investigators to identify him as a suspect. He emphasized that while the arrest was a significant milestone, the case was far from over. Smith would be arraigned the following morning, and the prosecution would present their evidence to a grand jury seeking a formal indictment. The Monahon family took the podium last, with Patricia speaking on behalf of her husband and daughter. "12 years ago, someone took our daughter away from us in the most violent way imaginable," she said, her voice breaking. "We have lived every day since then wondering who did this to Kelsey and why. Today, we finally have answers to the who, even if we may never understand the why." She continued, "We want to thank the investigators who never stopped working on Kelsey's case, the scientists who developed the gassing technology that made this arrest possible, and the community members who kept Kelsey's memory alive. Most of all, we want Kelsey to know that her voice was finally heard, and that the person who silenced it will face justice." The press conference lasted 30 minutes, with reporters asking questions about the investigation, the evidence, and the upcoming trial. As the family left the building, they were surrounded by supporters who had gathered to show their solidarity and celebrate the long-awaited breakthrough in the case. The weeks following Smith's arrest were filled with intense preparation as both the prosecution and defense teams organized their cases. Smith remained in custody without bail, classified as a flight risk given the severity of the charges and his history of relocating frequently. His court-appointed attorney, public defender Maria Santos, faced the challenging task of defending a client whose DNA had been found under the victim's fingernails. The prosecution, led by Assistant State's Attorney Jennifer Walsh, worked with investigators to build a comprehensive timeline of events surrounding Kelsey's murder. They subpoenaed Smith's employment records from 2010, hoping to establish definitively whether he had legitimate reasons to be in the Milford area around the time of the killing. The evidence revealed that Smith had indeed worked for a landscaping company that had contracts with several properties in Milford, though not specifically with Kelsey's condominium complex. However, investigators theorized that his work in the area would have familiarized him with the neighborhood and residential buildings, potentially explaining how he came to target Kelsey's home. DNA evidence would be the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Dr. Kim prepared detailed reports explaining the genetic analysis and the statistical probability of the match. The evidence was particularly strong because it had been collected from under Kelsey's fingernails, indicating direct physical contact between the victim and her attacker during the struggle. Defense attorney Santos focused on challenging the chain of custody for the DNA evidence and questioning whether the genetic genealogy methods used to identify Smith were scientifically reliable. She also planned to argue that the prosecution's theory of how Smith gained access to Kelsey's building was speculative and not supported by direct evidence. The case was assigned to Superior Court Judge Thomas Harrison, an experienced jurist known for his careful management of complex criminal trials. The trial date was set for September 2023, giving both sides several months to prepare their arguments and organize witness testimony. The arraignment took place in a packed courtroom on a humid morning in May 2023. Brian Smith, dressed in an orange jumpsuit and shackled at the waist, stood before Judge Harrison as the charges were formally read. His face showed no emotion as the judge detailed the allegations against him: murder in the first degree, home invasion in the first degree, and assault in the first degree. When asked how he pleaded, Smith spoke for the first time since his arrest. "Not guilty," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the courtroom's ventilation system. His attorney, Maria Santos, stood beside him, her hand resting supportively on his shoulder as she entered formal not guilty pleas to all charges. The Monahon family occupied the first row behind the prosecution table, their faces tense as they got their first close look at the man accused of killing their daughter. Patricia held Robert's hand tightly, while Jennifer sat with her arms crossed, studying Smith's face and trying to understand how someone could commit such violence against an innocent person. Judge Harrison set a trial date for September 18, 2023, and addressed the question of bail. Prosecutor Walsh argued that Smith posed a significant flight risk given his transient lifestyle and the severity of the charges, while defense attorney Santos requested that he be released to house arrest with electronic monitoring, citing his lack of recent criminal convictions and community ties. After reviewing Smith's criminal history and the strength of the evidence against him, Judge Harrison denied bail. Given the nature of these charges and the defendant's history of relocating frequently, the judge said, "I find that no condition of release would adequately protect public safety or ensure the defendant's appearance at trial." As Smith was led away in handcuffs, the Monahon family exchanged looks of relief. He would remain in custody until the trial, unable to flee or potentially harm other victims. The next phase of their long journey toward justice would begin in 4 months. The trial of Brian Smith began on September 18, 2023, with jury selection in Judge Harrison's courtroom. The process took 3 days, as both prosecution and defense attorneys carefully questioned potential jurors about their knowledge of the case, their opinions on DNA evidence, and their ability to remain impartial despite the emotional nature of the charges. The selected jury consisted of 8 men and 4 women, ranging in age from 25 to 62. Several jurors worked in technical fields and expressed comfort with scientific evidence, while others had experience serving on previous criminal juries. None had personal connections to the victim or defendant, and all pledged to base their verdicts solely on the evidence presented during the trial. Assistant State's Attorney Walsh delivered the opening statement for the prosecution, standing before the jury with a photograph of Kelsey Monahon displayed on a large monitor. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about DNA evidence that waited 13 years to tell its story," she began. "Kelsey Monahon fought for her life on the night she was murdered, and in doing so, she left us the genetic fingerprint of her killer." Walsh outlined the prosecution's case methodically, explaining how advances in forensic science had finally identified Smith as the perpetrator. She described the original investigation, the years of frustration as the case went cold, and the breakthrough that came through genetic genealogy in 2022. "The defendant's DNA was under Kelsey's fingernails," she emphasized. "There is no innocent explanation for how it got there." Defense attorney Santos presented a different narrative in her opening statement. She acknowledged that Smith's DNA had been found at the scene but argued that the prosecution's theory of how and why the murder occurred was based on speculation rather than facts. "DNA evidence can tell us who was there," she said, "but it cannot tell us what happened or why. The prosecution wants you to fill in the gaps with assumptions and theories, but that is not how our justice system works." The battle lines were drawn for a trial that would determine whether 13 years of waiting would finally result in justice for Kelsey Monahon. Dr. Jennifer Kim took the witness stand as the prosecution's star expert, carrying with her a binder thick with laboratory reports and scientific analyses. For over an hour, she walked the jury through the intricacies of DNA evidence, explaining how genetic profiles are extracted, analyzed, and compared. Her testimony was technical but accessible, using analogies and visual aids to help the jurors understand the scientific concepts underlying the case. "DNA is like a genetic fingerprint," Dr. Kim explained, showing the jury enlarged images of genetic markers on a computer screen. Just as no two people have identical fingerprints, except for identical twins, no two people have identical DNA profiles. The probability that the DNA found under Miss Monahon's fingernails came from someone other than Mr. Smith is less than 1 in several trillion. The prosecution presented detailed evidence about how the DNA samples had been collected, preserved, and analyzed over the 13-year period. Dr. Kim testified about the chain of custody procedures that ensured the integrity of the evidence, addressing potential defense challenges about contamination or degradation of the samples. Detective Captain Rodriguez testified about the investigation that led to Smith's identification through genetic genealogy. She explained how the Cold Case Unit had used ancestry databases and family tree research to narrow down potential suspects, emphasizing that Smith's DNA match had been confirmed through traditional forensic methods. The jury listened intently as investigators described Smith's background, his history of violence against women, and his presence in the Milford area in 2010 through his landscaping work. While the prosecution couldn't prove exactly how Smith had gained access to Kelsey's condominium, they presented a compelling circumstantial case that placed him in the right geographic area with the means and opportunity to commit the crime. Medical examiner Dr. Patricia Williams testified about Kelsey's injuries, describing the multiple stab wounds that had caused her death. The testimony was difficult for the family to hear, but it established the violent nature of the attack and supported the prosecution's theory that Kelsey had fought back against her attacker, collecting his DNA under her fingernails in the process. The courtroom fell silent as Patricia Monahon walked slowly to the witness stand, her hands trembling as she placed them on the Bible to take her oath. She had waited 13 years for this moment, the opportunity to tell a jury about the daughter whose life had been stolen and the family that had been shattered by violence. Kelsey was the light of our family, Patricia began, her voice steady despite the tears flowing down her cheeks. She was kind to everyone she met, always willing to help a friend in need, always looking for ways to make the world a better place. She wanted to get married someday, have children, make a difference in her community. All of that was taken away from her on June 15, 2010. Patricia described the last conversation she had with her daughter, a routine phone call about weekend plans that ended with, "I love you too, Mom." She told the jury about the devastating phone call from police, the horror of learning that Kelsey had been murdered, and the 13 years of grief and frustration that had followed. Every birthday, every holiday, every family gathering, Kelsey's absence is like a physical pain, Patricia continued. We set a place for her at Christmas dinner. We light candles on her birthday. We talk to her grave when we visit the cemetery. But nothing can bring back the conversations we'll never have, the milestones she'll never reach, the grandchildren she'll never give us. Robert Monahon followed his wife to the stand, describing his daughter as his best friend and sharing memories of teaching her to ride a bike, helping her with homework, and walking her across the stage at college graduation. His testimony was interrupted several times as he struggled to compose himself, the weight of 13 years of grief evident in every word. Jennifer testified about growing up with Kelsey as her older sister and role model. She described the survivor's guilt she had experienced, wondering why her sister had died while she was allowed to live, marry, and have children. The impact statements revealed the ripple effects of murder, how one act of violence had devastated an entire family and changed the trajectory of multiple lives. Defense attorney Maria Santos began her case by challenging the prosecution's timeline and theory of the crime. She called witnesses who testified about Smith's character, including a former girlfriend who described him as troubled but not violent, and a co-worker who remembered him as unreliable but not dangerous. Brian Smith is not a perfect man, Santos acknowledged in her questioning. He has made mistakes, struggled with alcohol, and had difficulties maintaining steady employment and relationships. But making poor life choices does not make someone a murderer. The defense focused heavily on the lack of direct evidence connecting Smith to Kelsey's condominium on the night of the murder. Santos pointed out that no witnesses had seen him in the building, no security cameras had captured his image, and no physical evidence beyond the DNA had linked him to the crime scene. Santos called Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a defense expert in forensic genetics, who questioned some of the methods used in the genealogical analysis that had led to Smith's identification. While Dr. Martinez acknowledged that the DNA match itself was valid, she raised concerns about the reliability of using ancestry databases for criminal investigations. Genetic genealogy is a powerful tool, Dr. Martinez testified, but it is not infallible. Family trees can be incomplete or inaccurate, and the assumption that database participants represent the general population may not always be valid. The defense also challenged the prosecution's theory about how Smith had gained access to Kelsey's building. Santos argued that the landscaping connection was speculative and that the prosecution had not proven Smith had ever been to that specific condominium complex. In cross-examination, Santos pressed Dr. Kim about the possibility of secondary transfer, the idea that Smith's DNA could have ended up under Kelsey's fingernails through indirect contact rather than a violent struggle. While Dr. Kim maintained that secondary transfer was unlikely given the amount and location of the biological material, Santos succeeded in raising questions about alternative explanations for the evidence. Assistant State's Attorney Walsh rose for her closing argument, knowing that this was her final opportunity to convince the jury that Brian Smith had murdered Kelsey Monahon. She stood before the 12 jurors with a photograph of the victim displayed prominently on the courtroom monitors. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is ultimately about scientific truth," Walsh began. "DNA evidence doesn't lie. It doesn't have an agenda. It doesn't make mistakes. Brian Smith's DNA was found under Kelsey Monahon's fingernails because he put it there when he attacked and killed her 13 years ago." Walsh methodically reviewed the evidence, emphasizing the statistical impossibility that the DNA had come from someone other than Smith. She addressed the defense's arguments about secondary transfer and alternative theories, pointing out that the defendant had no innocent reason for any contact with the victim. "The defense wants you to believe in an extraordinary coincidence," Walsh continued. "They want you to believe that Brian Smith's DNA somehow found its way under a murder victim's fingernails through some mysterious indirect contact, despite the fact that he claims never to have met Kelsey Monahon. The far simpler explanation is the correct one: he killed her." Defense attorney Santos delivered her closing argument with equal passion, acknowledging the strength of the DNA evidence while arguing that questions remained about the prosecution's theory of the crime. "DNA can tell us who," she said, "but it cannot tell us how, when, or why. The prosecution is asking you to convict Mr. Smith based on theories and speculation rather than facts." Santos emphasized the lack of witnesses, security camera footage, or physical evidence beyond the DNA that placed Smith at the crime scene. She urged the jury to consider whether the prosecution had truly proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt or whether significant questions remained unanswered. The closing arguments lasted most of the day, with both sides making passionate appeals to the jury's sense of justice while approaching the evidence from completely different perspectives. Judge Harrison delivered his final instructions to the jury at 4:30 p.m. on a Friday afternoon, explaining the legal standards they must apply in reaching their verdict. He defined reasonable doubt, described the burden of proof that rested with the prosecution, and outlined the specific elements of each charge that had to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. "You must base your verdicts solely on the evidence presented during this trial," Judge Harrison emphasized. "You cannot speculate about facts not in evidence or let sympathy for either the victim's family or the defendant influence your decision." The jury retired to the deliberation room at 5:15 p.m., carrying with them binders of evidence, transcripts of key testimony, and the weight of a decision that would determine whether Brian Smith would spend the rest of his life in prison. They elected James Crawford, a retired engineer, as their foreman and began their discussions by reviewing the charges and the evidence supporting each one. The Monahon family waited anxiously in the victim services room, unable to eat or concentrate on conversation, as they wondered what the 12 strangers in the jury room were deciding about their daughter's case. Patricia held the same photograph of Kelsey that she had carried to every court hearing, running her fingers over the glass as if she could somehow touch her daughter's face. As evening approached, the jurors requested to review the DNA evidence and Dr. Kim's testimony about the statistical probability of the match. They also asked for clarification about the legal definition of reasonable doubt, suggesting they were taking their responsibility seriously and carefully considering all aspects of the case. At 9 p.m., Judge Harrison dismissed the jury for the weekend, instructing them to return Monday morning to continue their deliberations. The Monahon family drove home in silence, knowing that 13 years of waiting for justice would be decided by 12 people they had never met before this trial began. The jury resumed deliberations at 9 a.m. on Monday morning, their faces serious as they filed back into the deliberation room. Word had spread throughout Milford that a verdict might be reached soon, and supporters of the Monahon family began gathering outside the courthouse, holding signs with Kelsey's photograph and messages of support. At 2:30 p.m., the bailiff knocked on Judge Harrison's chamber door with news that every lawyer in the building had been waiting for. The jury had reached a verdict. Within 30 minutes, the courtroom was packed with family members, reporters, and community members who had followed the case for over a decade. Brian Smith was led into the courtroom in handcuffs, his face pale and his movements unsteady. He sat beside his attorney at the defense table, staring straight ahead as Judge Harrison called the court to order and asked the jury foreperson to rise. James Crawford stood slowly, holding a folded piece of paper that contained the decision that would determine Smith's fate. The courtroom was so quiet that the air conditioning system seemed deafeningly loud as everyone held their breath. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Harrison asked. "We have, Your Honor," Crawford replied, his voice clear and steady. "On the charge of murder in the first degree, how does the jury find?" Crawford unfolded the paper and looked directly at Brian Smith before speaking. "We find the defendant guilty." A collective gasp rose from the gallery, followed immediately by quiet sobs from Patricia Monahon. Robert reached over and squeezed his wife's hand as tears streamed down both their faces. After 13 years, 4 months, and 6 days, a jury had officially declared that Brian Smith was responsible for their daughter's death. On the charge of home invasion in the first degree, how does the jury find? We find the defendant guilty. On the charge of assault in the first degree, how does the jury find? We find the defendant guilty. Judge Harrison polled each juror individually to confirm their unanimous decision, then scheduled sentencing for the following month. Brian Smith showed no emotion as he was led away, but his attorney placed her hand on his shoulder in a gesture of support. The sentencing hearing took place on a crisp October morning, exactly 13 years and 4 months after Kelsey Monahon's murder. The courtroom was again packed with family members, community supporters, and members of the media who had covered the case from its cold case breakthrough to its final resolution. Judge Harrison allowed victim impact statements before imposing sentence. Patricia Monahon spoke about the family's long journey through grief and their struggle to find meaning in their daughter's death. "Kelsey was taken from us in the most violent way imaginable," she said, "but her legacy is that she never gave up fighting, even in her final moments. That DNA evidence under her fingernails became her voice, speaking for her when she could no longer speak for herself." Jennifer Monahon addressed Smith directly, describing how her sister's murder had affected her own life and her children's lives. "You didn't just kill Kelsey," she said. "You changed the trajectory of our entire family. But you didn't break us. We're stronger because of what Kelsey taught us about love and perseverance." Brian Smith was given the opportunity to speak but declined to make a statement. He sat silently at the defense table as Judge Harrison reviewed the pre-sentence report and the jury's recommendations. "Mr. Smith," Judge Harrison began, "you have been convicted of the brutal murder of an innocent young woman who had her entire life ahead of her. The evidence shows that Kelsey Monahon fought for her life, and in doing so, she provided the evidence that would eventually bring you to justice." Judge Harrison sentenced Smith to life in prison without the possibility of parole on the murder charge, with additional consecutive sentences on the home invasion and assault charges. The sentence ensured that Smith would never again have the opportunity to harm another person. As Smith was led away to begin serving his life sentence, the Monahon family embraced outside the courthouse. The long journey was finally over. Kelsey's killer would never walk free again. That evening, the Milford community gathered for a candlelight vigil in Kelsey's memory. Hundreds of people filled the park near her childhood home, holding candles that flickered in the autumn breeze. Patricia Monahon spoke to the crowd, thanking everyone who had kept Kelsey's memory alive during the 13 years between her death and justice being served. "Kelsey's name can now be spoken with peace rather than grief," she said. "She was not just a victim, she was a daughter, a sister, a friend, and a fighter who never gave up, even in her final moments. Tonight, we celebrate her life and the justice that she helped achieve." As the candles burned in the darkness, Kelsey Monahon's story reached its conclusion not with the violence that had ended her life, but with the truth that had finally emerged from silence and the community that had refused to let her be forgotten. Her killer would spend the rest of his days in prison, but her memory would live on in the hearts of everyone who had fought to ensure that her voice was finally heard.